Preservation Committee in Milton, New Hampshire, and I'm sure she'll explain more about why she's able to come here. I thought it was going to be grant paid, but apparently not.
Well, hi, and thank you guys for coming out on such a beautiful night. Appreciate you being here. My name's Caroline Hughes. I work with the Loon Preservation Committee. We're an organization that primarily works in New Hampshire, but we do cover several of the New Hampshire main border lakes, including Great East Lake, Balch Lake, Horn Pond, which is why I'm presenting for you here tonight in Acton, Maine. There are other groups that cover the other lakes in Maine, and so, if you spend time on a different Maine lake, and you're interested in the loons there or what's been going on, Maine Audubon is a great organization to contact for that, and also there's Loon Conservation Associates. But tonight I'll give you a little bit of a primer on loons, their biology, their behavior, the nesting process for them, and then I'll go a little bit into the threats that loons face when they're on our lakes, and then we'll wrap up with a little bit of a description of the work that my organization does, which is also, a lot of those other organizations are doing similar work throughout the state of Maine. So the common loon is one of 5 loon species that exists in the world today. The others are the Pacific loon, the yellow-billed loon, the Arctic loon, and the red-throated loon. But the common loon is the only loon that breeds south of Canada, and so the only loons that you'll see on, that we'll see on our lakes here in New England, for breeding anyway. The red-throated loon does winter off of the New England coast, and so especially during the migration season, spring migration in April, and then fall migration, now through November, you might see red-throated loons stop over on your lakes as they make their way to the ocean. But the common loon is the only loon species that breeds here. And they look sort of similar to some other birds that are on our lakes. And so I like to, cover some of the field markings for loons, because at least at LPC, sometimes we get calls about, loons in distress that turn out to actually be geese in distress or mergansers in distress. So some of the things that distinguish the loon, physically include that checkered pattern on the back. Although other species might have similar coloration to loons, none have that distinctive checkering. The loon also has this black and white striped collar, and on the front you'll see in pictures that I show coming up, it has a smaller black and white striped necklace right down around the base of its chin. The loon also has that really characteristic bright red eye, right? And then they have this really long, sharp, we refer to it as a dagger-like bill. And a little bit later, I'll talk about how loons actually do tend to use that bill like a dagger when they're in territorial confrontations with other loons or even other birds on the lake. So those are kind of the 4 big characteristics that can help you distinguish loons from other similar species or similar looking species when you're on the water. But loons don't have that plumage throughout the year. So around this time, you might start seeing your loons molt into their winter plumage. The molt usually starts around the base of the bill. So you'll notice in this photo that the feathers at the loon's bill are starting to turn white. And then it'll progress across the head, so you might see your loons looking kind of scruffy, salt and pepper colored within the next month or so. And then by the time they get to their ocean grounds, they look entirely different. So this is a common loon, an adult common loon in its winter plumage. They're much more drab gray. Their bill, you'll notice, fades down to a gray or white as well. And that eye, it stays red, but it dulls down to more of a reddish brown. And so sometimes, we get photos from people who are on the coast and they, say this bird has the shape of a loon, but it does not look like any loon I've ever seen. And so, if you don't realize that loons go through this change, you might not recognize that bird on the ocean as a loon. You'll notice that the loon in this photo is enjoying a lobster dinner. And so their diet really does, it doesn't change a ton, but it becomes much more varied when they're on the ocean. When they're on our lakes, loons primarily eat fish. They're what we call piscivorous. When they're on the ocean, though, we get photos all the time of, loons eating lobster or crabs or shrimp or marine worms, skates, and, other things of that nature, snails. So Their diet definitely diversifies, and in order to be able to cope with the change from freshwater to saltwater environments, loons have a supraorbital gland, so a gland located above their eye, that essentially functions as, similarly to a kidney. It helps them to extract salt ions from their blood, and so they're able to filter out the salt from the water that they're drinking on the ocean or the food that they're eating. Once that is extracted, it is concentrated into a really, really saline solution, and then it's excreted through their nostrils. So if you ever see, a photo of, a lot of birds that spend time on the oceans have that same thing. So if you see a photo of a bird that has what looks like fluid coming out of its nostrils, it's probably that, that salty fluid that they're excreting to, help themselves cope with being on a saltwater environment. So loons spend their winters on the ocean. New England loons, and I can't speak for Maine loons specifically because I don't have the access to that data, but we know that the majority of banded New Hampshire loons that have been resighted on the ocean have been resighted off of the New England coast. And for Maine loon, it's probably the same thing. They're probably not going that far during the winter. And that's an advantage because that means that when spring comes, when the days start to get longer and they start to realize that the breeding season is approaching, because they're wintering so close to their breeding grounds, they're able to make recon trips and go check on their lake, see if it's open. If it's open, they'll land. If it's not open yet, they'll either head back to the ocean to wait, or they might find another water body that is close to theirs that already has opened up. Loons do tend to return to their lakes the day of or the day after ice out. They track it pretty closely, and those recon trips help them to do that. It's really beneficial for loons to be able to get back to their territory as soon as possible. And the word territory just means, an area that an animal defends from other members of its species. So loons are a territorial species. They want, themselves and their mate to be on their lake or their part of a lake if they're on, a larger lake. They don't want any other loons there because other loons are a threat to them. They're a threat to any chicks that they might produce. And so loons will defend their territories pretty fiercely. I'm not sure how well you can see this from back there, and you're welcome to come up and look at it at the end of the presentation, but what I have here is actually a loon sternum. My organization collects every dead loon that is reported to us in New Hampshire, and we necropsy it. And what's been found is that about 50% of the loons that come in have holes in their sternums that are actually puncture wounds from fights with other loons. Most of the time, loons are able to, heal up from this. They don't die from it. Only about 6% of the loons that we've collected have been found to actually have died from a wound from a fight with another loon. So they're fighting pretty aggressively and sometimes killing each other, but not always. And they're fighting that aggressively for control of that territory. A common misconception is that loons mate for life and that when they're fighting, they're actually fighting for their mate. Unfortunately, after banding loons and being able to track individuals for many years, what we found is that a loon is really more dedicated to its territory than it is to its mate. It turns out it's a lot harder to find, a good place that has a good nest site, a good amount of fish, and good brooding areas for the chicks than it is to find a good mate. And so if an intruding loon comes in, and an intruding loon is a loon that does not have a territory of its own and is looking for one. And about 40% of loons will acquire their first territory by challenging, a member of an established pair and kicking them out of theirs and just taking over. And so if that happens, the mate of the loon that got kicked out will just accept that they have a new mate because it's easier to, accept a new mate than it is to go off and find a new territory that is good. So loons are, as much as we like to think of them as these serene, beautiful birds, they do have kind of that dark side to them. So I mentioned that loons don't mate for life, but they do tend to mate long-term. So there's about an 80% chance that the loons that you are seeing on your lake are the same pair that you've had in the past. That's because they have high rates of territory fidelity. If they have had success on a lake in the past, they want to come back and have that lake again. But as far as we know, our loons don't spend the winter together. Typically in the fall, one will leave, a week or two before the other, and the second one leaves. And as far as we're aware, they're spending the winter apart. And so when they return to the lake, they need to sort of reestablish their pair bond before they're ready to get down to nesting. But unlike in some other birds, courtship between loons is really, really subtle. So if you ever see, a crazy, splashy, flashy dance, that's probably not your pair, that's probably a fight. Because, when loons are with their mate, really all they do is kind of drift around together peacefully. You might see them fishing together and diving in sync. You might see them do what they're doing in this photo, which is a bill dip. It's just kind of a deferential behavior that mates show each other. And then when we get to, mid-May on, you might start to see your loons kind of scoping out nest sites. So together they'll go, really close into the shorelines of islands or marshy areas, and check it out. They might get up on land, they might, start to build a little nest bowl and then get back into the water. Sometimes loons will build a couple different nest bowls in a couple different sites before they settle on the site that they are going to actually nest at and put their eggs down on. So just because you see nest building doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to start nesting right away. But when they do nest, loons typically lay 2 eggs. Sometimes they only lay 1, and on really, really, really rare occasions, they may lay 3. But most often it's 2, and most often those eggs are laid about 24 hours apart. Loons incubate pretty much consistently, but they don't start that consistent incubation until the second egg is laid. So sometimes we get calls from people who are concerned because their loons have laid 1 egg and now they're just ignoring it. They've been away from the nest for hours. But that's pretty common. Usually they won't start, sitting on the nest consistently until they have their clutch complete. And the incubation period is 26 to 28 days from the laying of the first egg to the hatch of the second chick. The male and the female of the pair will share their incubation duties pretty much equally. Towards the beginning of the incubation period, the male tends to do a little bit more of the incubating. That's because the female has just produced and laid 2 eggs about this size, so it's a pretty good size egg, 3 to 4 times the size of a chicken egg. So it takes a lot of energy for her to produce and lay those. So at the beginning of the incubation period, she needs a little bit of extra time to be able to forage and get her energy stores back up. But by the time we're a couple weeks in, they're incubating pretty much 50-50 between the male and the female. While one is on the nest, the other one is doing what it needs to maintain itself. So it's foraging, preening, which is something that they do to keep their feathers waterproofed. They may sleep. If you ever see a loon on the lake just floating with its head resting on its back, that's what they do when they sleep. They do everything in the water, and we'll get into why a little bit later. And when loons sleep, just sort of a fun fact, they don't, sleep for long periods of time. It's typically 15 to 25 minutes, and they'll sleep several times throughout the day in those sort of short bouts. And so then because the eggs are laid asynchronously, they're laid, 12 to 24 hours apart, they also tend to hatch asynchronously. And so that can create a dominant structure between the chicks, where that first hatched chick, it's had a day's worth of feeding before its sibling hatches, so it's a little bit stronger, and it will let its sibling know who's boss. So, you may see loon chicks really going at each other, pecking each other, and that's usually the first hatched chick letting the sibling know that, when food comes, I get to eat my fill before you get to eat anything. It can be tough to watch that as an observer, but it's a behavior that they have evolved to ensure that in lean years where, there might not be enough food to go around, that at least one chick is going to be survived because its needs will be totally met, rather than having 2 chicks who have needs that are only half met. So tough to watch, but there's a reason why they do it. And then I will add that re-nesting may occur if a first nest attempt fails. Last year in New Hampshire on a lake in Ossipee, we had a pair of loons that actually nested 4 times. The poor things, they were on the nest from May through early September. They never ended up hatching any chicks. That's less common. Typically they'll only re-nest once, sometimes twice. But usually if it hits, late July and, they haven't nested successfully, they're not gonna try to start a new nest attempt, because at that point it's too late, and the chicks won't be able to grow enough before ice comes in to get off the lake. So they do seem to have some sort of sense of, when it does and does not make sense to start a nest attempt. So once those chicks hatch, they're what we call semi-precocial. So precocial in that there's a lot that they can do right off the bat. You know, they hatch with down already, and they really only need a couple of hours on the nest to dry off before they're able to get in the water and swim. They can sort of dive, you know, on day one, although they're really buoyant at this point, so they kind of just pop right back up like a little cork. But there's a lot that they can do. But the semi-precocial comes from the fact that they are heavily dependent on their parents for food and for protection. You know, 100% of their food at this early age has to come from their parents. And so a scene like the one in this photo is pretty common for the first 2 weeks of the chick's life. This chick is back riding on one parent while being fed by the other parent, and typically, you know, that second parent is just going to be diving and coming up with fish after fish after fish, because this chick needs to go from this size, when they hatch they weigh about 100 grams, they can fit in the palm of your hand, to the size of basically an adult loon within just 12 weeks. So it requires a lot of feeding. Back riding helps the chicks in a couple of ways. First is it gives them protection from underwater predators. Again, those chicks are really small and they're an easy target for snapping turtles or even large fish. And so being up on the parent's back just, you know, gives them a little bit of protection from that. Second is temperature regulation. Because they're so small, these chicks can lose heat really easily, especially if they're in the water. And so being able to snuggle under their parents' wings, you know, just helps keep them warm. And then the third thing is energy, right? Again, they're small, they don't have good energy stores just yet, and so being able to hitch a ride on mom or dad's back instead of having to swim for themselves just helps them conserve, you know, the little energy that they do have. But as I mentioned, the chicks do not stay small for long. So the chick in this photo is 5 to 6 weeks old. At that point, you know, they start to lose the down that they're hatched with, and it's replaced by their first set of plumage. At the beginning of the chick's life, you know, the first couple of weeks, a lot of the energy that they eat is dedicated to growing their legs and their feet, and also their heads and their bills. And that's important because those are the things that help them to swim, dive, and catch fish. So that's why, you know, they tend to grow there first. So especially when loon chicks are young, their feet are really, really oversized compared to their bodies. This chick, you know, a 5 to 6 week old chick can provide 30 to 40% of its own food, but it's still really, really heavily dependent on the parents. And so the behavior it's doing in this photo is begging. If you ever see your loon chick just seeming like it's being really annoying to the parent, they'll headbutt them, they'll, you know, bite at their parents' necks or even their parents' bills. That's them telling the parent that they're hungry and they'd like to be fed. And then by the time they're 12 weeks old, loon chicks are considered fledged. You know, when they're 8 weeks old is when they start practicing flight and exercising their muscles so that they can, you know, build them up and be able to fly. By 12 weeks old, they should be able to fly. They can provide 100% of their own food, although they still will beg their parents and, you know, receive a free meal whenever they can. And when we get to that point in the summer, you know, when they're old enough, the parents will start to spend a lot more time away from the chicks. And, you know, in mid to late September, one parent might actually leave for the ocean. And then the other parent will stick around for another week or two, but then that parent will leave too. And then the chicks are on their own to find their way to the ocean for the first time. And so they must hatch with some pretty good instincts because, you know, they don't have anyone to show them how to get there. It's pretty common to see large groups of loon chicks, you know, in October or November, sort of staging for migration and taking off together. And that could be a safety in numbers thing, you know, where they're just more likely to get where they need to go if they all go together. Once the chicks leave for the ocean, they won't come back to inland lakes until they're 3 years old. So they spend those first 3 years on the ocean. That might partially be because, you know, if an immature loon comes back to the lakes, they're seen as competition by the adults, and an immature loon is no match for an adult loon in terms of a fight. So it could be that, you know, it's just safer for them to stay there to, you know, until they're mature. When loons are 3 years of age is when they're first able to develop that breeding plumage. It's when they're reproductively mature and able to breed for the first time. But what we found is that it's more often that they're not successfully producing chicks until they're about 6 years old. You know, they need a couple of years to find a territory of their own, to figure out that territory, you know, check it out and figure out where the good nest sites are. And so on average, a loon will not reproduce until it's 6 years old. In New Hampshire, the average loon pair will only fledge one chick every other year, so they have a pretty slow rate of reproduction. But they make up for that by the fact that they live a very long time. So the oldest known loon in New Hampshire was banded as an adult in 1993, so that was 29 years ago. And she was at least 3 years old at the time because she was in her adult plumage, so she's at least 32, but she had chicks at that time. And so if she was, following the average loon, then she would have been 6 years old at that time, making her 35 years old this year. She was back this year. She was not part of a pair this year, however. But the oldest known loon in the world is a female that breeds on in the Saney Wildlife Refuge in Michigan. She's in her mid-30s, I think 35 or 36. And until this year, her mate was a 34-year-old male, but this year they broke up, they went their separate ways, and she had a new mate. But she produced chicks this year, so, they have a long lifespan, and they can continue to produce chicks even into their 30s, and perhaps longer. We only started banding loons in the 80s and 90s really intensively, and so, we might find that they live to be 40 or even 50. We're not sure yet. So that's sort of the loon primer. Any questions on any of that before I go into the threats section? All right, I will continue on. So I like to use this photo for the threat section because it looks to me like something out of the loon version of Jaws. And also because it demonstrates some of the body adaptations that make loons really, really good in the water, but really, really bad on land. So you'll notice that the loon's legs are positioned pretty much as far back as they could possibly be, right? If this were a goose or a duck, these legs would be about mid-body, and that would allow it to have a much better center of gravity and would allow it to be able to walk upright. And in addition, you can't see it in this photo, but unlike other birds, loons have really dense, thick-walled bones instead of hollow bones. So they're really, really heavy birds. And those two things, the weight of them and the placement of the legs, make it so that loons cannot move well on land. They're really awkward. If you've seen a loon, get up to go on its nest, that they kind of flop down on their bellies and then scoot themselves along. So it's a really slow way of moving. It's a really energy-intensive way of moving. And it means that when they're on land, loons are really vulnerable to predators, right? And so if a loon were to nest in a spot far away from the water and a predator came, that loon would have no chance of getting back into the water and it would be predated. And so because of that, and to save energy, loons tend to nest at spots like this that are really, really close to the edge of the water. And on a lake that hasn't been dammed, that's usually fine. Typically, if there are several days of rain in a row, a loon on a natural lake can sort of grab muck and build up its nest to keep pace with rising water levels. But on lakes that are dammed that might experience much more rapid water level fluctuations, nests can get flooded, if the water levels rise quickly, and they can also get stranded if the water levels fall. And stranding is just, when the water level drops so much that it's way too much energy for a loon to get back and forth to its nest, and so it ends up abandoning the nest. So water level fluctuations have been a problem for loons in New Hampshire and really across all of the loons' breeding range. Human disturbance is another big one. So you'll notice the loon in this photo is sitting upright. That's a relaxed loon. That loon is not feeling any stress. But when loons feel threatened by something when they're on the nest, they'll assume this position where they're craned down towards the water. And this serves two purposes. First, the loon is trying to minimize its appearance in an attempt to hide from whatever it's perceiving as a threat. And second, this is essentially a diving position for a loon where all it needs to do is kick its feet and it's back in the water where it's much more mobile and more able to, get away from whatever it's considering a threat. And we most often see this happen when people in boats are getting too close. Either intentionally or because they don't realize that the nest is there. So I'm sure, folks coming to this presentation, you probably already know this and I'm preaching to the choir, but if you ever do see a loon in this position, it's best to just slowly back away until it, raises its head back up. Because if you stay in the area when a loon is doing this, most likely it will flush off of the nest. And that's a pretty violent motion. It's very quick, and they can kick their eggs off in the water. as they're flushing off of the nest. And even if the eggs stay on the nest, they can be exposed and vulnerable to predation, or to, if it's a really hot day and it's an exposed nest site, they might heat up to a point where they're no longer viable. So the best thing for loon eggs to be able to develop correctly is to keep the adults on the nest. And so yeah, again, if you ever see a loon like this, it just needs a little bit more space. But loons on the water need space as well. And so I just have this slide in here to show some of the other behaviors that loons might do to indicate that they need a little bit more space. So the two behaviors at the top are loons that they're not stressed yet, but they're a little bit concerned. And if, they're approached more closely, they might become stressed. So the loon up on the top left is extending its neck up. They do that to get sort of a better look around the area and better evaluate whatever they're perceiving as a potential concern. The loon on the right is squaring off its brow, so they have muscles at the top of their head, and when they're feeling concerned, they contract them and create that kind of squared appearance. Sometimes we get photos at we get calls at the Loon Center from people who are concerned that like the loon might have gotten bonked on the head and is swelling or something, but it's usually just a response to being approached too closely. And then the loons on the bottom here are stressed. So the chick on the left here is doing basically what the loon craning over on the nest was trying to do. It's minimizing its appearance. It's sinking down lower in the water to try to hide. And then the loon on the right here is doing what we call a penguin dance. That's a distraction display essentially, and it's, a loon doing that is usually really stressed out. They have to paddle their feet really rapidly in order to maintain that position where their chests are up and exposed. And that takes a lot of energy. And for wild animals, they really need every bit of energy that they get, right? They have to fight for every meal that they have. And so, wasting energy unnecessarily on a penguin dance because they were too closely approached can be a problem for them. So all of these behaviors are things that loons will do in response to any threat. So, it might be that an eagle's flying overhead or an intruding loon is coming into their territory. But if you ever see any of these and you don't see anything in the area that appears to be causing it, then it could be that you're causing it and that the loon just might need a little bit more space. Again, thank you. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir on that, so I appreciate you letting me just run through that. And there are some other threats to nesting loons as well. So shoreline development, the places that loons like to nest also tend to be the places that we like to put our houses or our docks or our beaches. And on some lakes, there's been such intensive development that loons have been pushed into really marginal quality nesting sites where, they're just much more likely to get hit by a predator or fail for some other reason because it's just not a good site to nest at anymore. Human commensal mammals are those mammals that, have always been around, like raccoons, but now maybe around at higher densities because they have human sources of food, like garbage. Raccoons are opportunistic predators of loon eggs, and so just having more of them around makes it a little bit more likely that if a loon leaves its nest unattended for whatever reason, it might get predated. Avian predators, so I always feel the need to stress at this point of the talk that at LPC we're not anti-eagle, we're not anti-crow, we're not anti-gull. Those are the things that loons have been dealing with for, for as long as they've been around, and we prefer them to deal with those natural threats rather than, the human ones. But in the presence of all these other human-caused threats, it's just kind of one more straw on the camel's back. So important to bring up, I think. Contaminants is something that's a relatively new area of research for us at LPC. So every year, we monitor the nests in New Hampshire, and if a nest fails and the eggs are abandoned, we'll first make sure that the eggs have been abandoned by following our protocol to guarantee that, and then we'll collect those eggs. And we're able to test a small subset of the eggs that we collect each year for chemical contaminants, including PFAS, PCBs, DDT, and others. And what we found is that in eggs from certain lakes, and actually, eggs from most of the lakes that we've tested, there are levels of those contaminants. And, for a number of the eggs that we've tested, at least one contaminant is at a level that is high enough to, have been found to cause reproductive impacts in other species. So it's important to note that we haven't yet, figured out what levels are important for loons, but it's definitely a concern that we're finding that, those chemicals at levels that have, negatively impacted other species. So, this is an active area of research for us. If you're interested in learning more about the contaminant research, we have a whole talk on that on our YouTube channel. It's just Loon Preservation Committee. And then on our website, loon.org, we have our full egg report that details what we found in every egg that we've tested to date. Another threat, and really the biggest threat to loons, at least in New Hampshire, is lead fishing tackle. So I mentioned before that loons are piscivorous. They primarily eat fish. And if a loon, catches a fish that has broken someone's line and has their tackle attached to it, or if a loon strikes at someone's line, which they do tend to do, they're visual predators, and if they see tackle being reeled in, they might mistake that for the glint of a fish swimming by and strike at it. Or sometimes they will steal a fish off of someone's line. We wish they didn't, but they will do that sometimes. And if that person is using lead tackle, then the loon will ingest not only that fish, but also the tackle. And that is pretty much always a death sentence for a loon. They'll die within 2 to 4 weeks of ingesting lead tackle. In New Hampshire, we have, since 1989, really consistently collected and gotten a necropsy for every loon that has been reported to us. And what we found is that from 1989 through last year, 40% of the adult loons that died in New Hampshire died after ingesting lead tackle and getting lead poisoning from that. So it's by far the largest cause of loon mortality. And unfortunately, it's had a pretty big effect on our loon population. Here are just some radiographs that show loons that were either rescued or came in as mortalities that had lead tackle in their gizzards. And so the reason why it's been such a big problem for loons in New Hampshire has to do with that life history that I talked about earlier. Loons are reproducing or adding, chicks to the population really slowly, one chick fledged every other year. But they make up for it by the fact that they live for such a long time, and so will have multiple chances to reproduce over their lifetime. But if you cut that adult loon's lifespan short, you're losing not only that loon, but you're also losing any chicks that it might have produced. And you're also destabilizing the territory. Usually if a pair member is lost, it takes a couple years before that territory is producing chicks again, because another loon needs to fill in and then might need to become acquainted with where the good sites are. So usually if you lose a loon, that territory is down for a couple of years. And so our organization published a paper in the Journal of Wildlife Management back in 2018 that showed that the loss of adult loons to lead poisoning had significantly reduced our population's growth rate. So it's definitely been a problem, and I encourage anyone who fishes or knows someone who fishes to consider switching to non-lead tackle. And I'll talk in a little bit about a program that we have and that Maine Audubon also is operating in Maine to help people make that switch. Okay, so yeah, I hate to leave things on a negative note with all the threats, so I like to wrap up by just talking about some of the things that are being done to help loons cope with those threats. So my organization was founded in 1975 in response to a really dramatic decline in New Hampshire's loon population. At that time, there were fewer than 100 pairs of loons remaining in the entire state, which was really low compared to historic levels. And sort of the founding principle was that if human actions had contributed to those declines, and it seemed very likely that they had, then human actions could also help to reverse those declines and bring the loon population back. And so that's what we've been working to do since 1975 through a combination of different areas of work. So first is management. So this is a loon nest raft, and it's designed to help loons deal with many of the threats that I mentioned earlier. So a nest raft will rise and fall with water levels, so that a loon nesting on a raft will not have its nest flooded, its nest will not get stranded, even if there are major changes in water level over the course of their nesting period. The rafts also, they mimic a small island, which is a loon's ideal nesting site. And so on lakes that have been so intensively developed that there's, not a good natural site left, these rafts can provide an alternative. We anchor the rafts, usually 30 or so feet from shore, so it doesn't guarantee that a raccoon isn't going to swim out and predate the eggs, but it does make it a little bit less likely that they'll get hit by a mammal in that way. And then finally, the rafts have the cover overhead, which has a couple of purposes. First, it's sort of an avian predator guard. It gives them a little bit of camouflage from that and a little bit of a physical barrier. And they also provide shade so that, you know, the loon sitting on this raft isn't out in the hot sun. We will also float signs in high traffic areas where, you know, the loons are very likely to be closely approached by boats, just to let people know that the nest is there and that they shouldn't be approaching that area closely. These are the signs that we use on Lake Winnipesaukee, which is New Hampshire's largest lake. It's a really highly utilized lake, and so the signs that we put out on smaller lakes tend to be a little bit more polite. They say, please stay away, instead of just keep out. And then on some lakes where, you know, even in spite of having signs, people have continued to get too close, we might also put out rope line just to, you know, provide a physical barrier and show people you should not be getting closer than this to this loon nest. We do a lot of public education and outreach, so presentations like the one I'm giving tonight. We also do some loon cruises on Squam Lake. If you're ever in the area, I highly recommend them. My coworker Tiffany has been surveying the loons on Squam for over 10 years, so she knows those particular loons very well, and she's very knowledgeable, so definitely recommend them. They're run in partnership with the Squam Lakes Natural Science Center. We also run a live loon cam every year. And so we start the loon cam usually in May. We'll set it up before the loons start nesting so that if you're watching the loon cam, you'll be able to see every step of that nesting process, from, you know, the loons coming and choosing the nest site, building up the nest, laying the eggs, incubating them. And then we get a really cool close-up view of the hatch. So I like this photo because you can see that the chick over here has already hatched. And then there's what we call a pip on this egg. So that white spot there is where the second chick is starting to break its way out. So, you know, you get a really close-up view. Our loon cams are done for this year, but we have highlights on our YouTube channel, and it'll start up again probably mid-May next year. So if you're interested in watching live next year, you can find that on the Loon Preservation Committee YouTube channel. And then the lead tackle legislation in buyback was our attempt to address the problem of lead poisoning in loons. So our data and testimony was really vital in closing up some loopholes in New Hampshire's existing lead tackle law. So now in New Hampshire, we have the strictest lead tackle laws in the nation. It is illegal to sell or use in fresh water lead sinkers and lead-headed jigs that weigh 1 ounce or less. That's the type and size of tackle that's been found most often to be killing loons. But just because you can't buy it anymore doesn't mean that people don't still have it from before the ban went into effect. And again, we're the strictest law in the nation, so people can still, you know, go to other states and buy tackle that is illegal to buy in New Hampshire, but that can be bought elsewhere, and bring it and use it. And, you know, in New Hampshire, we get a lot of visitors, especially over the summer, who maybe, you know, bring their old tackle box and don't realize what is in it is harmful to wildlife. So, in addition to, you know, getting that legislation passed, we've also really worked on education about lead, and we've started up a buyback program where, you know, at 9 participating retail locations throughout the state, people can turn in 1 ounce or more of that illegal tackle. In exchange, they get a $10 voucher to that store that they can use to buy replacement tackle or other supplies. And the people who turn in the largest and second largest amounts of tackle at each participating retailer will win a $100 and a $50 cash prize respectively. So, you know, we're trying to really incentivize and help people make the switch to tackle that is not harmful to loons and to other, you know, birds like eagles or mergansers or, you know, other fish-eating birds. So I know we're in Maine right now, so I will say that Maine Audubon is also running a lead tackle buyback program. I'm not sure what their collection sites are, but I'm sure they have it on their website. I know Kittery Trading Post is at least one of the sites, but I don't know about the others. But definitely check out Maine Audubon's site if you're interested in participating in their buyback program. We'll do loon rescues. So loons just have this uncanny ability to get in trouble over the course of the summer. So if people report a tangled loon to us, or, you know, a loon that's beaching itself, or, you know, just a loon that is clearly in distress, we will go out and try to catch it. If we catch it, we'll, you know, try to deal with whatever its obvious ailments are, whether that's untangling it or what have you. We usually will take a blood sample to test and make sure that there's nothing, you know, underlying going on. We'll take it to a vet and get a radiograph for it, again, to make sure that nothing's broken, or, you know, there are no other problems that can be detected that way. And then our goal is really to get these loons back in the water as soon as possible, so that they can, you know, be back in their natural environment and doing what they need to do. So if you're on a lake that, you know, shares a border with New Hampshire, like Great East or Balch, you can definitely call us if you see a loon in distress. If you're in Maine, I think Maine Audubon is the group to call. And then we do a lot of different research projects. So banding and tracking loons. I have some bands here if anyone would like to take a look at them later on. But the way that we band loons is we give them 2 bands per leg. One is a silver U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service band that has a unique ID number on it for each loon. And then the color bands are just used to give them a unique combination, so that, you know, there's only one loon in North America that will have silver over green on its left leg and red over orange on its right leg. So that, you know, in the future, it's pretty hard to see the bands, let alone be able to read a number on them. So having the colors allows us to identify loons using binoculars from a safe distance. And having banded loons allows us to, you know, learn basic information about them, like how long they live, or where they go in the winter, or, you know, things about juvenile loons, where they return to in relation to where they were hatched, and, you know, other things of that nature. Causes of loon mortality. So again, you know, we collect and necropsy every dead loon that's reported to us. That allows us to determine what killed that individual loon. And when you're getting it for a number of loons, you know, it allows you to see if there are any trends in what's killing loons. So studying causes of mortality is how we were able to figure out that lead poisoning is such a big problem for loons. And we're continuing to monitor, you know, what loons are being killed by, so that if there's, you know, an emerging threat, we can start to work to address that. Effects of climate change on loon reproduction. Loons are a northern species, and here, you know, in Maine and in New Hampshire, we're pretty close to the southern edge of their breeding range. There are breeding loons in Massachusetts, but below that, not really. So, you know, our long-term data going back to 1975 has shown that in warmer and wetter years, loon reproduction tends to go down pretty dramatically, and warmer and wetter is what it's predicted to be in the future here in New England, right? So we're keeping an eye on that and trying to figure out if there are ways that we can help loons deal with our changing climate. We're looking at the effects of contaminants on loon reproduction. I covered that a little bit earlier, and again, we do have a full, like, 45-minute long talk on that on our YouTube channel if you're interested in learning more. We're looking at cyanotoxins in collaboration with Jim Haney's lab at UNH. I'm not sure if it's the same here, but in New Hampshire, we've had a big increase in the number of cyanoblooms on lakes across the state. And so, you know, every time we band a loon, we take a blood sample, we send some of that blood to Jim Haney's lab so that he can look and see if there are cyanotoxins in it, what levels. And then we've had at least one loon in New Hampshire actually die from poisoning from cyanotoxins, documented by the lab at the University of New Hampshire. So, you know, it's an emerging concern for a lot of people who live on lakes in a lot of ways, and we're trying to, you know, figure out how it might be impacting our loons as well. Effects of lead on loon survival and population growth, just continuing to kind of keep our finger on the pulse in that way. And then we, you know, whenever we can, we try to document the causes of nest failure. It's not always obvious, you know, sometimes unless you were there at the moment that the nest failed, you don't know what caused it to fail. But when we can, you know, if there's information that can, you know, lead us to believe that it was predated by a mammal or washed out by a boat wake or whatever, you know, we do try to document that so that, similar to the causes of mortality, we can, you know, keep an eye on what's causing nests to fail and potentially come up with new management activities to help loons cope. And then we do monitoring, so we count loons. We divide New Hampshire up into 5 regions, and then each of the big lakes, Squam, Winnipesaukee, and Umbagog, gets its own biologist. And they're going out to count loons and figure out how many loons there are, how many of those loons are part of a pair versus singles, how many of the pairs actually nest in a given year, because it turns out that only about 2/3 of our loon pairs that form actually have a nest attempt, how many chicks are produced, and then how many of those chicks survive to the end of the season. In total, we monitor over 350 lakes in New Hampshire. And that monitoring allows us to see how our loons are doing as a whole, as well as, how effective our management is at helping to bring the population back. So our loon population in New Hampshire has more than tripled since LPC started its work in 1975. Back then, there were fewer than 100 pairs of loons. And this past summer, we haven't finalized the data totally yet, so this number might change, but we had 341 pairs of loons in the state. So we're pretty pleased with that rate of growth. It's been, a relatively slow growth and hard fought, but it's encouraging and exciting to know that, it is possible to help a species recover in that way. And that's all I had prepared, but I'm glad to take any questions that anyone has. And I'll also say that I put on the back table some non-lead fishing tackle. If you fish or know someone who does, please feel free to take some. We're glad to, hand that out and get people using it.
Do loons move from lake to lake, or do they hold on one lake?
So they'll only really, they'll hold their breeding territory and, spend most of their day there, but they will fly over to forage on other lakes. Throughout the course of the breeding season, and then especially at this time of year, late summer, early fall, those loons that have not nested successfully become less tied to their own territory, and they'll start to group up on other lakes and, socialize a little bit more. So you might start, if you haven't already been seeing big groups of loons on the lakes, you might start seeing, 5, 10, or even 20 plus loons on a given lake. But yes, throughout the course of the season, they will visit other lakes. Yes?
On Square Pond this year, I didn't see any young loons. Usually we have a nesting pair, and we usually have chicks. Over the years, I would say, more often than not. But this year, one thing that I've seen is that even in July and into August, there were a group of about 14 or 15 loons.
Wow.
That made a lot of noise and hung out together. They've all gone now. But is that like harmful or helpful, or what? You sort of spoke about that. Someone told me once that sometimes they are young adults and they can be kind of rough on chicks.
Yeah, so those intruder loons, those extra loons, are the ones, usually we think they're the ones that are, they don't have a territory, they're looking for a territory of their own, and they can be looking to pick a fight with the members of the pair and try to challenge one and kick them out. And so when they're present consistently, it can lead, the pair can be so distracted with trying to maintain control of their territory that they just don't have time to nest. We've seen that in New Hampshire, definitely. I'm surprised to hear that there was such a big group so consistently. Usually it's, one persistent intruder, maybe a couple, but a group of, and I don't know how big the pond is. If it's a bigger pond, it may be, less.
Square is a little bit bigger than some of the others around here.
Yeah, so, 14, that's
the state calls it a great pond.
Okay, so maybe a little bit bigger. But still, a group of 14 or, large groups consistently throughout the whole season is a little bit less common, and it definitely sounds like that is probably why your pair didn't nest, because they might have just been so distracted and, trying to get those other loons out.
Was the water level was much lower this year at Square Pond.
Yeah.
Right now I see a lot of rocks between the water and the shoreline, and that's normal at the end of the season. But this year you saw that close to the beginning of August.
Yeah.
And so I know it was a very dry year, and I was wondering if that had an effect.
The nesting period is usually, mid-May through mid-July. So if water levels were more normal during that time, it wouldn't have had an effect. But, you know, if they were lower than normal and the loon's normal nest site was, you know, maybe a little bit too difficult for them to get to, then that could have contributed as well, for sure.
I found one abandoned nest,
You did?
We didn't, so.
but someone did.
Yeah. And did anyone, like, observe any odd behavior? But did anyone ever see the loons on the nest, or they just found it after the fact? Yeah. Yeah, I wonder, maybe they laid the eggs, but then got distracted from being able to incubate consistently because of the pressure from the intruders or something. Yeah, I mean, to me, it seems like the intruders, just from what it sounds like, would have been the biggest problem there, although, you know, not having been there or monitored it myself, I wouldn't know for sure, but.
I do have an eagle.
Yeah, so the eagles are less of a problem for the adults, but definitely a problem for chicks, and, you know, there have been some reports of eagles dive bombing loons off on the nest and, you know, having them leave the eggs unattended or even abandoning the nest because of repeated things like that. But if no one saw that happening, yeah, it might not have been that. It's really hard to tell if, you know, no particular incident is observed. Yeah.
Are you, in addition to the banding, are you also putting chips in them at all? I didn't hear you mention that.
Yeah, no, we're pretty low tech with it. It's usually just the banding. My organization did look into, the Modus system is becoming more popular with songbirds, but with loons, because they spend so much time in the water, we were told, you know, well, number one, we would have to wrap the antenna around the band, and that really shortens the distance that it can reach. And yeah, you know, after talking with representatives, you know, the people that sell that technology, it just seemed like not a great system for loons. Some organizations have done like surgical implants of tracking devices. My organization has not done that, because it does require in the field surgery, and we just personally did not feel confident or, you know, great about being able to do that in a safe way. So we're pretty low tech with just the bands. Great, well, thank you all so much. Oh, yes.
We had an abandoned nest, or what we were thinking was an abandoned nest a couple of years ago, because called somebody out from LPC to check it out. And he mentioned that to verify it, we'd come back for a couple of days just to check to see if the eggs had been turned.
Yeah, so that's our system for, you know, making sure that the egg has actually been abandoned. We'll come out, we'll take a pencil and put an X right at the top, and then we come back at least 24 hours later, and usually, you know, 36 plus hours later. If the egg hasn't been turned in that time, we know the loons, you know, haven't been back to the nest, they're not tending it, and it's probably not viable, definitely not viable. And so that, at that point is when we would collect it. But yeah, we don't collect them immediately. We, you know, usually try to make sure that the loons are definitely not tending it. So are you on one of those border lakes then? Yeah, which one are, Great East?
I think it was Jake who came out.
Yeah. Great, well, I did, I put some other materials in the back of the room if you're interested in, you know, a newsletter that talks about a lot of the work that we've done recently, or any of the other materials back there. Please do feel free to grab them. And thank you again for coming tonight, I really appreciate it.
Thank you.